Hello everyone, my name is Amira Turkey, and the title of my honors project is called All the Lies Through My Eyes, Media Misrepresentation of Latina and Arab Women. The reason I chose this topic is because I am Latina and Arab, and growing up I rarely saw women who reflected the full picture of either side of my identity. Instead, what I saw was just stereotypes that shaped how others viewed these communities and even how those within these communities started to see themselves. Through this project, I wanted to understand why those portrayals persist and the impact that they have. I'll examine how mainstream American media influences the public's perception and how it reinforces racial and gender inequality and affects the identity formation of Latina and Middle Eastern women. So in this next slide, we see a woman on the left who is visibly angry and holding a knife. And then on the right over here, we see a woman wearing a burqa with only the sight of her eyes. Before we dive into the specific stereotypes, I feel it's important to understand, why does representation matter in the first place? Well, most people don't personally interact with every single culture, so much of what they know just either comes from television, news, movies, and nowadays, social media. So when the portrayals are constantly being repeated over and over again, they start to feel normal, even if they aren't accurate. I've realized that many people's first impressions of my communities are often shaped by media rather than their real life experiences. And these portrayals don't just influence how society views Latina and Middle Eastern women, they can also influence how women themselves within these communities see themselves and where they feel they belong. My research thesis states that mainstream American media constantly portrays Latina women as hypersexualized and Middle Eastern women as oppressed or threatening. While both women are often portrayed through different stereotypes, these portrayals lead to the same results, in which they reduce women to simplified identities instead of actually recognizing them as individuals. So throughout this presentation, throughout the case studies I present and the different examples, I will be connecting how these repeated representations shape public perception and how they reinforce these gender and racial hierarchies and how women within these communities understand themselves. By connecting media examples with sociological theories, my main objective is to show that authentic representation doesn't just consist of inclusion. It's essential for challenging those with biases and supporting healthier identity development. So as we know, the media has become very prominent in recent decades. And the stereotypes we see doesn't just exist in just one place. They appear across films, television, news, whichever news outlet you watch, and nowadays, social media. Although each platform presents themselves in different ways, they still reinforce the same underlying message. When people are exposed to these portrayals constantly, they start to accept them as the norm or even as truthful. I personally have seen how these repeated messages can shape people's expectations before they even meet somebody from either community. That's why I feel it's so important to examine representation across multiple different forms of media, not just one source, because together they have the power to shape public perception on a much larger scale. So to better understand these patterns, I've used 3 sociological frameworks that explain not just what kind of stereotypes they are, but why we continue to see them. My first framework is intersectionality, developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. She explains that people don't experience discrimination just through one part of their identity. No, there are multiple factors, such as race, gender, ethnicity, and religion. These create unique experiences for women like Latinas and Middle Eastern women. Our second framework is Edward Said's theory of Orientalism. He explains how Western societies have historically portrayed the Middle East as either exotic or a whole 180 of just being dangerous. These portrayals have influenced the way Middle Eastern people, especially women, are represented in media. And for my last framework, I have Laura Mulvey's concept of the male gaze. Each explains how women are often portrayed from a male perspective. And within that perspective, it reduces them to objects of desire than actual individuals with their own voices, ambitions, and identities. So, as I discuss different examples throughout the slides, I will be referring and connecting them back to these three theories to show why these stereotypes aren't just random. They're a part of a larger social pattern that shape how people think and how inequality is reinforced. So I'm going to start off by looking at how Latina women are commonly portrayed in mainstream American media. While these portrayals may seem entertaining or harmless, they often rely on a narrow set of stereotypes. Latina women are frequently depicted as either hypersexualized or fiery, loud, or limited to roles like the domestic worker or the new love interest. One example, many of you may know her and have seen the show, is Gloria Delgado Pritchett from Modern Family. Although she is hilarious and arguably one of the best characters, many of her defining traits revolve around her appearance, her exaggerated accent, her emotional personality, and her sexuality. Growing up, I rarely saw Latina women portrayed as just intelligent or ordinary people with the same range of personalities and experiences as everyone else. Instead, they were often reduced to a handful of familiar stereotypes. That's important because when these are the only stories audience repeatedly see, they can begin expecting Latina women to fit these stereotypes. So when they actually encounter them in person, most people might be disappointed. This reflects the male gaze, where women are often valued more for how they look than for who they actually are. One of the most powerful examples of these stereotypes come from the actress herself, America Ferrera's TED Talk. My identity is a superpower, not an obstacle. Early in her career, a casting director told her, "Could you do that again but sound more Latina?" What was her response? Well, it was simple. She said, "What does a Latina sound like?" That question exposes the problem. There isn't one way to sound Latina, yet the entertainment industry expected her to fit a preconceived stereotype. Ferrera also spoke about turning down roles like the gang member's girlfriend or the sassy shoplifter or even the pregnant chola because she didn't want to contribute to the stereotypes that reduced Latina women to just one-dimensional characters. Instead of changing the industry to fit her identity, she felt this pressure to have to change herself. She discussed about straightening her hair and trying to stay out of the sun and being on diets to lose weight and dressing differently in hopes of being seen as acceptable. That shows how media stereotypes don't just shape the public perception. They can also influence how people feel they need to present themselves. Her story really resonated with me. It reminded me that representation isn't just about seeing someone who looks like you on screen. No, it's about seeing someone who reflects you to your full humanity. That's why Ugly Betty was so significant. Betty wasn't just defined by her appearance or a stereotype. She was smart, she was ambitious, she was funny and complex. This allowed for millions of Latina women to finally see a character who felt real and felt like somebody they could really resonate with. Now, I'd like to shift to the other side of my identity and look at how Middle Eastern women are portrayed in mainstream American media. So compared to Latina women, who, as we saw before, are overly sexualized or seen as like loud and spicy, Middle Eastern women are usually portrayed in the complete 180. They are shown as either oppressed, submissive, silent, connected to terrorism, or as women who constantly need to be rescued by Western societies. Although these stereotypes are very different, they yield the same result. They reduce millions of diverse women to just a single narrative and ignore the richness of their cultures, their personalities, and their experiences. I found it striking that one side of my identity was portrayed as too much, while the other was portrayed as having no voice at all. Neither representation reflects the women I know in my family or within my community. These portrayals don't just shape how others see Middle Eastern women. They can also shape how these women start to see themselves in their everyday life. That's why it's important to recognize that these aren't isolated stereotypes. They are reoccurring patterns that influence the public perception and reinforce inequality. Media scholar Evelyn As-Sultani offers another important perspective on this issue. In her TED Talk, she shares that her parents sometimes hid parts of their Arab identity because they feared discrimination. That personal story illustrates how stereotypes don't just affect public opinion. They can influence how people feel they need to present themselves in everyday life. Also, Tani argues that the biggest problem isn't that Arab and Middle Eastern women are portrayed negatively. No, it's that they are rarely portrayed in ordinary ways. We don't see them as doctors, teachers, students, business owners, mothers, or neighbors simply living their lives. Instead, they are repeatedly reduced to a small number of familiar narratives, whether that's the victim, an oppressed woman, or someone associated with conflict, especially political conflict. That idea really stood out to me because it reminded me that representation isn't only about avoiding harmful stereotypes. It's about showing the full diversity of people's lives. Growing up, the Arab women I knew were strong, educated, resilient, and deeply involved within their families and communities. Those are the stories I long to see reflected in mainstream media. The stereotypes we discussed today can be better understood through Edward Said's theory of Orientalism. He argued that for centuries, Western societies have portrayed the East as mysterious and dangerous. These portrayals weren't simply descriptions. They created an image of the East as fundamentally different and specifically inferior to the West. When those ideas repeated in television, films, and news, they shaped the way audiences perceive Arab and Middle Eastern people. That's why we so often see women portrayed as voiceless or in need of rescue, rather than as individuals capable of telling their own stories. Orientalism helps explain that these portrayals aren't just random. They're a part of a much larger historical pattern of representation. Before researching this project, I hadn't realized there was a sociological theory that explained why these stereotypes keep appearing. Learning about Orientalism really helped me understand that these portrayals weren't isolated examples. They reflected a broader pattern that has influenced how Arab and Middle Eastern people have been represented for generations. When we compare these portrayals side by side, something important becomes very clear. Although Latina and Middle Eastern women are represented through very different stereotypes, those stereotypes ultimately accomplish the same thing. They reduce women to simplified identities instead of recognizing them as the unique individuals that they are. This was one of the biggest takeaways from my research. I realized that one side of my identity was over-sexual and emotional, while the other was silent, oppressed, and threatening. Even though those stereotypes are way different, neither one of them reflected the women I know. This is where intersectionality becomes very important. It reminds us that gender, race, and ethnicity and religion don't operate on their own. They intersect to shape people's experiences in different ways. Latina and Middle Eastern women may experience different stereotypes, but both are affected by the overlapping systems of inequality that limit how society sees them, and in some cases, how they start to see themselves. For my last framework, I used Laura Mulvey's concept of the male gaze. She argued that women in film and media are often portrayed from the male perspective, where they are valued more for what they represent or how they appear than for who they are as complete individuals. For Latina women, this means being portrayed as objects of desire for their bodies, their sexuality, and appearance became the focus, while their intelligence, ambitions, and individuality receive far less attention. For Middle Eastern women, the male gaze works a little differently. Instead of being portrayed primarily as objects of desire, they're often portrayed as just symbols of oppression, conflict, and political debates. This is where media representation moves just beyond entertainment and it begins to have real social consequences. When the same stereotypes are constantly repeated, they don't just stay on our screens. They start to influence the way people think, the way they interact, and behave with one another. They can reinforce prejudice and shape beauty standards and create unrealistic expectations about how Latina and Middle Eastern women are supposed to behave and look. These portrayals can also influence identity development, especially during childhood and adolescence, when many young people are trying to understand who they are and where they belong. I understand how powerful representation can be. When you rarely see people like yourself portrayed accurately, it's easy to feel like parts of your identity are either invisible or misunderstood. At the same time, these stereotypes affect people outside of these communities as well. If media is constantly presenting the same narrow images, audiences may begin to accept those portrayals as the reality. That's how stereotypes just become normalized and how prejudice will be reinforced and broader systems of racial and gender inequality continue. In conclusion, this project has shown that media doesn't simply reflect society, it actively helps shape it. This research helped me better understand why I so rarely saw women who reflected the full part of my own identity. I realized that the issue wasn't just individual stereotypes. It was a broader pattern of representation that left very little room for authentic stories. That's why more accurate representation isn't simply about inclusion or diversity. It's a sociological necessity. When media tells more authentic stories, it helps challenge prejudice. It supports healthier identity development, and it reminds us that no one should ever be defined by a stereotype.